Welcome back to Just Scribble. Today we are going to talk all about the paper that I'm using for my 2026 lineup. So if you follow me on Instagram or here on YouTube or even on my Facebook page for the shop, you know that I am not using Sanzen Tomoe River paper in any of the products that I'm launching with my 2026 lineup. I made the decision last fall actually that I was not going to be using Sanzen Tomoe River paper for 2026. So I wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about that decision, share with you guys the papers that I'm using in my 2026 lineup, and do some testing of those papers. So to start with, let's talk about why I'm not using Sanzen Tomoe River paper for 2026. Really two reasons why I'm not using Sanzen 52 GSM Tomoe River paper for 2026. The first is probably the easiest reason to explain and probably the one that you are most likely expecting, and that's the inconsistency in the 52 GSM paper that Sanzen has been producing. So if you guys are using any Sanzen 52 GSM Tomoe River paper planner or notebook that was produced for a 2025 launch, you probably know that the paper is very inconsistent. I do have videos on this and I will link them in the cards up above, but the paper is just not up to my standards. It can be inconsistent from book to book or even page to page, whether you're using fountain pens, markers, highlighters, even gel pens and ballpoint pens. And that's just not something that I can have in my products. I can't have a paper that I know is inconsistent. Now, you guys probably know that I did give feedback to Sanzen on the paper issues, as did some other planner shops. And Sanzen has been, according to them, making some changes and improvements to their quality control and to their processes. However, paper that's been tested this year, not only by myself, but by others as well, has not performed well. So I could not rely on that paper or that Sanzen would make the proper improvements consistently for 2026 planners. Additionally, I had shared when I very first launched my planners and I did my first video on my planners that I had actually intended on using the 68 GSM Sanzen Tomoe River paper for my planners for 2025, because I had actually not intended to use 52 GSM Sanzen Tomoe River paper for my planners for even 2025. With my planner launch with plans, my goal was to fill gaps that I saw in the planner community, both in the layout and design and structure of planners, but also in the paper offerings. And I kind of wanted to bridge the gap between people that wanted paper that works well for fountain pens and people that don't like very thin, almost Bible-like paper. And so I had originally intended on using 68 GSM Sanzen Tomoe River paper for 2025, but when I tested that paper, it was absolutely terrible, and I do have a video on that. It will also be linked up in the cards up above. And I did go back to Sanzen with that paper as well, and they have made improvements to it. And I do have TN inserts in my shop in that improved paper, and it's actually performing quite well. But because of the continued inconsistencies with the 52 GSM paper, I didn't have confidence in their continued consistency in the 68 GSM. I just don't have confidence that the paper that Sanzen is going to produce is going to be consistent, whether it's 52 GSM or 68 GSM. So Sanzen's paper was immediately a no for me for 2026. So in the fall of 2024, I started researching and testing papers. So I tested over a dozen papers, probably close to 15 different papers, trying to find papers that I wanted to use for 2026. And although I can't share every single detail of that process, it does include finding out what papers are available that are not proprietary papers, finding out papers that are available in a size that allows for mass production of larger planners, like an A5 planner, finding out the cost of the paper and how that would impact the cost of planners that I'm offering, figuring out how to get that imported into my manufacturer, testing the actual paper with pens and markers and all of the things. And at the end of the day, I landed on 3 papers for my 2026 lineup. And those papers are B7, which is formerly known as Cosmo Air Light, Iroful, and View Corona. Now, B7 and Iroful are 75 GSM paper, and View Corona is a 52 GSM paper. So the View Corona is the same GSM as Sanzen Tomoe River paper, so it is a very, very thin paper. And as a result, it is not the primary paper in my 2026 lineup. It is in a couple of products that are coming with my 2026 lineup, but the 275 GSM papers are the primary papers in my 2026 lineup. And there's quite a few different reasons reasons why I decided to go with the 75 GSM papers for the majority of my lineup for 2026. But one big piece of that was, again, I want to fill the gap between paper that works really well for those of us that love fountain pens and those people that want a thicker paper that is not quite so thin and doesn't have so much ghosting. Now, I do know that not everyone is going to be pleased with 75 GSM paper because some people just really love super thin paper, or they don't want a planner that's quite as chunky because it will make your planner a little bit thicker because the paper is thicker. But for me, having a paper that performs well, that many people have loved and used and trust, and a paper that works with a lot of different mediums and that a lot of different people would enjoy, whether they use fountain pens, whether they use gel pens, whether they use ballpoint pens, was worth it to me to make this change for 2026. Now, I do want to say that just because I'm using these papers for 2026 does not mean that it's going to be the papers that I'm using for 2027, because I am still testing and researching papers. The process may never stop. I'm not really sure. But I will say that I'm continuing to test and research papers as I work through additional products that I want to launch in the future after the 2026 lineup, and as I think towards 2027's lineup as well. So that's kind of the background as to how I got to the papers that I got. So I've had my paper decisions kind of made and lined up for quite some time. So now what we're going to do is we're going to test the paper. So we are going to test all 3 papers against 2 other papers. So what I have here is I have the original Tomoe River paper, original Tomogawa TRP. And so I'm going to take 2 pieces of this paper out. And I'm going to write on here, so I don't forget, that these are original TRP. So this is white TRP, original TRP. I have 1 sheet of Sanzen 52 GSM. This was a good performing sheet of paper. I don't have any more of this in my stash, and so I just have 1 of this one to test, but I did want to test against a good piece of Sanzen Tomoe River paper. And then I have 2 sheets of each of my other papers. So I have 2 sheets of the B7, formerly Cosmo Air Light. I have 2 sheets of the View Corona in the white. So this is their lighter color. So the white, which is not bright white, is actually what I'm using in my View Corona product. So that's what we're going to test on. And then I have 2 sheets of Iroful. Now this does have grid because I didn't have any plain other than a notebook, and I wanted to do this all on loose leaf, but I have 2 sheets of the Iroful. So before we get started with the testing, I wanted to just talk to you guys a little bit about each of these papers, the 3 papers that I'm using in my 2026 lineup, and then go through what I'm going to test and how. So we'll start with B7 paper. So B7 paper is the new name for Cosmo Air Light. There were a lot of conversations about Cosmo Air Light paper going away. As I have been told from the paper mill, the paper didn't go away. They just rebranded it and called it B7 based on their favorite guitar chord. I do wish they had a different paper name for it, just because B7 is also a paper size. It's the same size as your passport size traveler's notebook inserts. And so I do wish the paper wasn't called B7, but it is B7, formerly Cosmo Air Light paper. So Cosmo Air Light paper does come in 2 GSMs, 75 GSM and 83 GSM. The GSM of the B7 that I'm using in my products is 75 GSM. It's a very smooth paper, but it does have drag when you write on it. The best explanation that I've ever seen about Cosmo Air Light and explaining how it feels to write on Cosmo Air Light is that it feels very similar to writing on a whiteboard. So that sort of smooth slickness with that drag that you get when you're writing on a dry erase board is the feel on writing on Cosmo Air Light. It does provide for beautiful shading and sheen in your fountain pen inks, but it does have a much slower dry time than the other papers that I'm offering. Also probably longer than most papers that you're used to using. So I do highly recommend, which I recommend pretty much with any paper, that you use blotter paper with your Cosmo Air Light or B7 planners and notebooks. It is known to be a very good fountain pen friendly paper, but again, it is 75 GSM versus the 52 GSM. So it does have a different feel. It has a sort of squishiness to it. Again, that smooth drag when you're writing, but it also just has a different feel. So this is original TRP and Sanzen TRP. So even those two, original TRP, Sanzen TRP, B7 paper. So it does have a different feel, a different bend to it. It's not stiff like marshmallow paper or a paper that you would get from Erin Condren, standard hemlock and oak paper, something like that. It's a much higher GSM, but it does have a different feel and a different stiffness to it. So next is the Iroful paper, and it is more of a bright white paper. The 275 GSM papers, the Cosmo Air Light and the Iroful, are whiter than the View Corona, as you can see there. And this is the View Corona white. And so it is a whiter paper. It is a 75 GSM paper. I do think that they may have an 80 GSM or something that's a little bit thicker, but the one that I'm using in my products is 75 GSM. It is silky smooth to the touch. It has a vivid color payoff when you are writing with fountain pen inks, markers, and things like that. It's quick drying, so it dries quicker than the B7 Cosmo Air Light, and it is great for brush pens and gel pens alike. And then for sound effects, this was the B7. This is the Iroful, Sanzen, original TRP. So again, it is thicker, so it's going to have a different feel to it than original TRP or even the Sanzen TRP. I really love Iroful paper though, so I hope you guys are really excited for the addition of this to plans. All right, and then last is View Corona. So View Corona starts at 52 GSM. I do believe they may have some other GSMs, but the only one that I'm familiar with is 52 GSM. It is a white paper, the one that I'm using, but it is a more cream white. It is not a bright white. It has a light tooth and some subtle feedback to it. It is lightweight, but it is very strong and durable. It has balanced shading when you're using your fountain pens, and it is an ideal paper for everyday writing. So compared to the Sanzen and the TRP, here is the sound. That's View Corona, Sanzen, original TRP. So all three of these are 52 GSM, but they do not feel the same. The View Corona is less flimsy. It has a little bit more structure to it than the Sanzen, which then has more than original TRP. I hope that was helpful. All right, so now we are going to do some testing, and I'm going to talk to you guys about how we're going to do this testing. So the reason that I have 2 sheets of each thing, well, except for the Sanzen, is that I actually am going to be testing watercolors as well as inks and stamps. And so I am going to be watercoloring on the secondary sheet of the ones I have second sheets on. So we are going to watercolor on original TRP, View Corona, B7, and Iroful. So I'm going to be watercoloring on these 4 sheets. And then these 5, original TRP, Sanzen, View Corona, B7, and Iroful, I'm going to be doing all the other testing. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and I'm going to share with you guys what I'm going to be testing on each one. And then I'm going to sit and test, but I'm not going to film that entire process because it is going to take a really long time to do the testing on this many pieces of paper and also wait for the paper to dry. And that just makes for a really long video that no one really wants to sit and watch listening to music, me doing the same testing over and over and over again on these different papers. So I'm going to cut the video when I'm doing the testing and then come back and show you guys the results. But before we do that, let's talk about what we are going to test. So I did mention on the 4 sheets, we are going to do watercolor testing. And I have one of my watercolor paint palettes. This is from the Art Toolkit. And I'm just going to watercolor with some of these watercolors on here. On the other stack, we're going to do pen, marker, and also stamp testing. So what I have pulled together is a lot of stuff, and I'm going to test all of these things. I think I just hit my camera. Sorry, guys. And I apologize if you hear noise. My husband and my kiddo are watching UFC. UFC, is that right? mixed martial arts, like ultimate martial art fighting in the other room. So it's probably kind of loud. Another good reason for me to not be filming while I'm doing this ridiculous amount of testing. So I am going to be testing with my Esterbrook, and I will write which nib size and ink for all the fountain pens that I'm using. But I'm going to be testing with this Esterbrook, with this Bennu, with my Bennu Pixie, with my Platinum 3776. That's the first one that I got. I have all 4 of them. With this fountain pen, which I cannot remember the name of because I cannot remember what small shop this is from. So we're testing all 5 of these fountain pens. I'm going to be testing this. I'm going to be testing with a Uni Jetstream, a Uniball Zento, a Live Color, an acrylic paint marker, a Crayola marker, a Tombow, an Ohuhu, and I'll probably pull a Zig Clean Color Dot as well, just so that I'm using both, because Ohuhus are known for bleeding through paper. A Click Art, a Sharpie permanent marker, a Sharpie S Gel, an Inner Gel, a Zig Brushable, a mild liner, and then 3 fountain pen inks with my Colorverse nib, and then I may do it with a Q-tip as well. So basically swatching these, this is a shimmer vintage copper, this is Sailor 4773, and this is a Mono ink from Sailor that is a dual shading. So we can see shading, and shimmer, as well as the color. And then I'm also doing some stamping. So I'm going to stamp with this Tim Holtz Distress ink. I'm going to stamp with this Versa ink in black, and this Memento ink pad in Rich Cocoa. So we're doing 3 stamps, 3 bottles of ink with different features, 5 fountain pens, and various assorted other dot pens, markers, gel pens, and ballpoint pens. So I'm going to be testing all of this on these papers. I'm going to come back and show you guys the results so you can see the colors, you can see the bleed through, the shading, the ghosting, all of the things. And then we will do a quick little test with a gel pen for dry time, just so that you guys can see the difference in the dry time between the 3 papers. So I'm going to do all this testing and I will be right back. Okay, I am back and I have finished all of the pen testing, swatching, stamping, watercolor, all of the things. So let me get this a little bit organized so we can compare. I did want to mention too, because I realized that I didn't mention this in the first part of the video, that some of you actually also tested, or some of my customers rather, did test some of this paper. They tested the View Corona paper or the B7 Cosmo Air Light paper. So I'd mentioned that when I first tested the Sanzen 68 GSM Tomoe River paper to use for my 2025 planners, that the paper did not perform. And then I did go back to Sanzen and I did share my feedback, and they did make improvements. And I actually created traveler's notebook inserts, so gridded inserts in the standard TN size, using the new improved 68 GSM paper. And customers that purchased those inserts received a QR code to provide feedback on the paper, to let me know what they thought of the paper, so that I would know if it was a paper that I wanted to use in products in the future, to see if you guys really liked the paper. And when I provided that QR code with their orders, I printed the QR code on sample paper. So I printed it on sheets of View Corona and sheets of B7 Cosmo Air Light paper. And with each order, they got a piece of this sample paper with the QR code with a space to test out that paper. So when they used the QR code and they went to give the feedback on the 68 GSM TRP paper, they also indicated whether they got paper A or paper B, because it was a blind testing, and they gave feedback on the View Corona paper and also the B7 Cosmo Air Light paper. And so I did take that feedback into account as I was working on my 2026 lineup and the papers for that, as well as paper for future products that I want to launch in the shop. And so I did want to mention that some of you may have helped with some of the feedback for paper testing for the papers. All right, so let's look at the watercolor paper separately, and we'll do the ink papers first. So I did the exact same testing on all 5 papers. So we have regular original TRP, we have Sanzen TRP, we have View Corona, we have Iroful, and we have B7 Cosmo Air Light. And everything is done in the exact same order, in the exact same placement. I do want to say that I am not a very good stamper. It's not something that I do very often, and I'm not very good at it. I really need to practice. And so some of the stamping may not be great, not because of the paper or because of the stamp, but because of the user. But I try my best to be as consistent as possible. I also try my best to swatch the same amount of ink so that we would have a really good comparison. So I'm going to go through the list of the things that I tested, and then I will show you the back side. So you can see ghosting, bleed through, etc. All right, so I used an Ohuhu dot marker, an acrylic paint pen, a Crayola marker, a mild liner, a Sharpie permanent pen, a click art pen, a Sharpie S-Gel 0.07, a Tombow, the Zig brushables, both ends, they're dual shading, so like one end is lighter and one end is darker, an Intergel 0.07, a Monami Live Color or Live Color, I call it Live Color usually, a Uni Zento in 0.38, a Uni Jetstream in 0.7, my Platinum 3776 in J. Herbin Pearl Noir, an Esterbrook Medium in Diamine Poinsettia, a Bennu Broad in Kobe Goshi Kiyama Ochre, a Bennu Extra Fine with the cartridge that comes with their pens, which is a Diamine Blue Black, a Little Pen Design Candy Nugget with Sailor's 2022 Pen Show ink, a Zig Clean Color Dot, and then I have 3 ink swatches here. So the first one is the Manyo Koke Dual Shading ink. The second one is Sailor 473, and then third one is Diamine Vintage Copper, which is a shimmer ink. And then I did 3 stamps. So this first one is with the Memento Rich Cocoa. Then we have the Tim Holtz Distressed ink in Peacock Feathers. And then we have a VersaFine in Onyx Black with just 3 different stamps. All right, so this is what it looks like on original Tomogawa TRP. You can see the shading in the ink swatches in the orange and also in the blue. And you can see, hopefully the camera is picking it up, the shimmer there. And then this is the back. So you do have pin dot bleed through on the 3 stamps and a lot of ghosting. You have a bleed through on the Sharpie permanent pen. You don't really have much bleed through on anything else. You do a little bit on that Intergel, the green one. And then you have a little bit of bleed through where I heavily swatched inks down at the bottom. And of course you have ghosting on pretty much everything. All right, so that's original TRP. For comparison, this is the Sanzen Good 52 GSM TRP. Good being that it's a piece of their good batch before their batches went awry. So everything is in the exact same order. You can see a comparison. You can see that the shading is not as prominent. It's actually non-existent pretty much on the Sanzen TRP, but you can see the shimmer ink, and the stamping is not as vibrant on the Sanzen. And then this is the back of the Sanzen, and this again is good Sanzen. So you have pinpoint bleed through on the stamping, the Sharpie S-Gel bled through, the Ohuhu kind of wants to bleed through a little bit. This, what pen is that? The Bennu Extra Fine with the Diamine Blue Black has some bleed through, and then there's no bleed through actually from this Sailor dual shading ink, but there is here. I probably heavily swatched this one more than this, and then a little bit there. So that's the back original TRP and Sanzen TRP, and a consistent batch of Sanzen. All right, so now let's compare to View Corona. So this is original TRP, View Corona, Sanzen. So like I said, it's a little bit stiffer. It doesn't kind of bend and wiggle in the exact same way. You do have really bright, vibrant colors on the swatching. You also have pretty good, vibrant colors on the stamping. I do believe that this issue here is more me stamping or adding ink than it is the paper, but the color is slightly different. But then the color on the Edelstein bottle as well, with the rich cocoa or dark cocoa, what was it called? Rich cocoa, is slightly different as well. And then you do have some shading, not as prominent as on the TRP, but better than it is on the Sanzen. And then you do have the shimmer Hopefully that's coming up. So you can see that shading difference in your inks. And of course, there is shading on these inks too. None of these are shimmer inks, but in person, it's going to be hard to pick up on camera, but like the poinsettia, you can see different shading on the original TRP. There's also shading on here on the ink, and there's also shading on here on those inks as well. All right, so let's flip the View Corona over and compare it. I have so much stuff on my desk. Okay, we're going to compare it to the original TRP, View Corona. So again, the stamps bled through, the permanent Sharpie pen bled through, the Ohuhu did not bleed through. There's a little bit of dot on that inner gel, but nothing else. Actually, I think the Ohuhu did better on the View Corona than it did on the original TRP. Original TRP View Corona. So you can see that. And then the swatching is a little bit less bleed through, but kind of similar. The ghosting is pretty similar, slightly less, but it's a negligible difference. If you can see that. All right. So next we will look at Iroful. So this is the Iroful. Now I will say that the stamping on this Edelstein was totally not the stamp or the paper. I had a piece of paper underneath here and it was kind of poofy, and I realized that I didn't get the stamp like placed down well. So it's not as crisp of an image because of me, not because of it. I did better on the other stamping. I'm just not very good at stamping. And we have all of the different colors. You still have the shading in your inks here. This was actually very enjoyable to write on. There's definitely a distinct writing difference writing on Iroful and B7 than there is writing on TRP and View Corona. Now, I will say that with Sanzen TRP, original TRP, when you write in your book, it's kind of squishy because you've got all the pages. And I was writing on loose leaf on my desk, which has a leather top on it. And so it was kind of a different experience writing on them without the book underneath, without all the pages kind of stacked underneath. But the smoothness of the B7 paper and the Iroful paper made for, in my opinion, a very pleasurable writing experience. I enjoyed writing on these two papers. It felt very smooth and comfortable. And then at the bottom, we have some swatching. There's some shading on these two, but it's not as dramatic as it is on the original TRP, but it is more dramatic. It's hard to tell. I wish I had had plain Iroful and not grid, but I feel like it's a little bit more dramatic than the View Corona, and it is definitely more dramatic than the Sanzen. So I will compare that for you. But you'd have the shading and the shimmer. So Iroful versus the original TRP, much more shading, some shading, some shading. The shimmer is about the same. Versus Sanzen. The inks on the Sanzen are just much flatter. You don't see any of the dimension, and you can actually see the dimension in the inks on the Iroful. Not to the level of TRP, but really, really nice, just the same. And then View Corona, you have, I guess, more shading on the View Corona, but in a different way. It pooled differently, so the shading performed differently. So you still have shading on the Iroful, but it's not in the same way as on the View Corona. There's some different dimension on the shimmer ink than there is on the Iroful because it kind of puddles and pools differently on the two. All right, then let's flip it over. So this is the back side. There is, let's see, one tiny dot of bleed through there. I probably held my pen there for a while. There is no bleed through from anything else, not even the Sharpie permanent pen. There is, of course, ghosting. As you can see, the stamps did amazing. The swatches didn't bleed through, and I'm very heavy-handed when I swatch on purpose because I want to see the ink properties. It did really, really well. So in comparison to the View Corona, let me move that out of the way. You have the Iroful and the View Corona, so much more ghosting and also bleed through with stamps and permanent markers and heavy swatching. Compared to Sanzen TRP, Less ghosting on the Sanzen than on the View Corona, but there's definitely more bleed through and more ghosting on the Sanzen than the Iroful. And then compared to original TRP, you'll see ghosting, a little bit more bleed through just in the stamping, the Sharpie, and the swatches. So let me do a quick front side, just because I feel like the 75 GSM paper is probably the paper that you're more curious about, because A, it is the paper that's in more of my products for my 2026 launch, but also because it's not something people are as familiar with, and it's kind of to fill that gap between the people that want to be able to use their fountain pens or their stamps, all their markers, all the things, and the people that want thicker paper, don't like ghosting. So Iroful original TRP, Iroful View Corona, Iroful Sanzen. All right. And then this is the B7 Cosmo Air Light. Now, one thing I will mention about Cosmo Air Light or B7 paper is, in addition to the ink taking a little longer to dry on this paper, it can make your pens, particularly fountain pens, write a little bit thicker than they write on other papers. And so they can appear a little bit thicker and a little bit less crisp. The way that the ink performs on the paper, the writing isn't quite as crisp with your fountain pens. But this is a comparison of the 275 GSM papers, so you can see that. And then we're going to look at the B7 in more detail. So again, the same writing samples all the way down. You do have shading here, and then the shading and the shimmer there. Ignore the kind of scratchy marks in here. They're like that on a couple of them. I didn't get all of this ink out of my nib when I started swatching, and so there's some blue in there. It's not because of the paper, it's because I didn't wash it out well enough because I was doing it at my desk. And then you have the stamps over here, so you can see that. And then let's flip it over. So there's a tiny bit of bleed through on these swatches. Now, like I said, I tried to be as consistent as possible with the swatching, but I was using Q-tip swatching and also my nib. So where is my nib? Okay, I don't know where it is, but it's kind of like a Kakimori nib, but it's color versus version. It's actually my first time to use it. And so I tried to be consistent. I tried to be as consistent as possible, but it's kind of hard to make sure you're laying down exactly the same amount of ink each time. Stamps don't bleed through. There's ghosting, but minimal bleed through. There's a tiny bit on this Sharpie, that little dot there, and a tiny dot on that inner gel. It is a new green inner gel, so it seems to be very, very wet. All right, so let's compare. So this is B7 compared to the TRP. So much less ghosting, much less bleed through, which you would expect because it's thicker paper, but in my experience, that doesn't necessarily mean anything. If you think about the Moleskine paper and all the issues that we've had with Moleskine's paper over the last, I guess about 2 years, everything bleeds through some of those batches, even though it's 70 GSM. So it's a little thinner than this, but it's quite a bit thicker than this. And even a mild liner, a Tombow gel pen, everything bleeds through on a lot of batches. So original TRP, B7. View Corona, B7. Sanzen Good Batch, Sanzen Good Batch, B7. And Iroful, B7. All right. I'm excited for these papers because I love swatching. It's so much fun. So I'm going to have to tip these into my planner because I want to keep them and I love them. I think they're so pretty. It was actually a lot of fun, but I am glad that I didn't try to film while I was doing it because it takes a really long time to do this over and over and over and over again. But it also takes time to wait for it to dry because I had to wait for these to dry. So on these swatches at the bottom, the top one of the blue, the top one of the orange, and the bottom one of the shimmer of the diamine, those are with my Colorverse nib. And then the two bottom ones and this top one on each of them is the Q-tip. So you have Q-tip, 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 Q-tip. Hopefully that's helpful. All right, so we did that, and now we are going to check out the watercolor. So I did 3 different watercolors. I could not tell you which watercolors these are because I did not have my little card inside my art toolkit. I usually have like a swatch card that tells me which inks are, or which watercolors are which, and I didn't have it in there. But I did 3 different ones. I'm pretty sure that this one is a schminke. I'm not sure what this one is, and then this one is a shimmer. So I did 3 different ones just so we would have some different comparisons you could see. And so this is original TRP, and that's the back. You get that nice kind of crinkle effect, if you can see that there. No bleed through, but definitely it changes the texture of the paper because you put water on it. And I did not do a water wash first. I just got the paint wet and then kind of swashed it on. So this is View Corona. So you can see a little bit more of like the details of that blue. The shimmer's about the same. And then you have some beautiful shading in that magenta. And then on the back, you can see the ghosting of the color, but no bleed through. And again, it gets sort of crinkly. TRP Original versus View Corona. So a little bit more ghosting on the View Corona, especially in that dark magenta. But let me move these out of the way. But pretty similar. Original TRP versus View Corona. So they performed pretty similar with the watercolors. And then we have B7 Cosmo Air Light. So again, you can see some of that variation in the blue. You can see the shading in the magenta, which is beautiful. And then you have that gold shimmer. On the back, you still get texture because you put water, but it doesn't have the same kind of crinkly, but it's a little bit more crinkly. So I'll make sound effects of this compared to just one with pen on it as well, but no ghosting. So B7 versus original TRP on the back. And on the front, sorry, trying to make sure I'm on the screen. And then compared to View Corona, front and back. And then this is Iroful. Now it performed a little bit different, but some of it I think is because of the grid, the print of the grid, but it really puddled really nicely. It did some really fun things. So you can see the magenta on there, and then the blue, and then the gold shimmer. And again, you can see a little bit of ghosting on the back on this one, but no bleed through, and you get a little bit of texture on that paper. So Iroful versus B7. Front and back. So Iroful B7. Iroful versus View Corona. And the front. And then you have original TRP versus the Iroful front and back. All right, let's do some sound effects. So you guys know that when you get TRP watercolored, it sounds really, really cool. It just kind of changes the sound of the paper. So this is Iroful. With watercolor. Without. Then B7. It distinctly makes a different sound. And then View Corona. It makes it a little bit more crunchy sounding. All right, so those are our ink swatches and our watercolors. And the last thing that we need to do is test the dry times. All right, so I'm going to do this with 2 different pens. I'm going to use my Sharpie S Gel. This is a 0.7, and I'm going to use my extra fine Century Platinum. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do 0, 5, 15, 0, 5, 15. So I'm going to do the gel pen at the top and the fountain pen at the bottom, and I'm going to do immediately after writing 5 seconds and 15 seconds. I was trying to decide, do I want to use the Sharpie S Gel? Let's use the Zento. So we'll do the Zento and the fountain pen. All right, so we're going to start with TRP. I'm going to do, this is a 0.5. So I'm going to write love, and then I'm going to do View Corona, Iroful, and the V7. And then I'm going to get my phone so I can time it. Timers. All right. Okay. I spelled love wrong. Don't judge. With this pen, I don't even know if I need the 15 seconds. All right, I'm going to skip the 15 seconds because there was no smearing after 5 seconds. All right, so with the Uniball Zento, 0 and 5 seconds. So this is original TRP, a little bit of smear at 0, nothing basically at 5 seconds. View Corona, same thing, more smearing at 0, but nothing at 5 seconds. We have Iroful, some smearing at 0, none at 5 seconds, and actually less smearing at 0 than we had on the View Corona. And then this is Cosmo Air Light. So we had smearing at 0 and then just like a tiny, tiny tidge at 5 seconds. So 6 seconds it would have none. All right, so we're going to do the same thing with my fountain pen. So 0. Ooh. All right. I'm sure we're going to have to do 15 seconds on this one. All right. Okay. All right, so I'm going to do 15 seconds, but I'm only going to do it on the 275 GSMs because everything was dry on the View Corona and the TRP, and I don't want y'all to have to sit through swatches for no reason. It really doesn't need 15 seconds. It probably only needs 10. I should have just done 10. Let's try 10. Oops. Okay, yeah, 10 works. We'll do both on this one too. Let me put 10 here. I'll do 10 first. Now, obviously, dry time can vary depending on the ink that you're using. Yeah, 10 seconds is plenty. And if you use blotter paper, which I highly recommend, then a shorter dry time works because it absorbs the extra ink that you have. All right. All right, So with the fountain pen ink, and this is J. Herbin Pearl Noir, which is one of my favorite black inks. I really, really love it. I love that and Platinum Carbon Black. Those are my two favorites. And I've tested a lot. So at 0 on original TRP, quite a bit of smear. At 5 seconds, nothing. On the View Corona, 0 seconds, you have smear, nothing. At 5 seconds, has less smear than the TRP. Then we have, let's do this. Then we have Iroful. So we have a smear at 0 seconds, just a little bit at 5 seconds, none at 15 and 10 seconds. You can see that there. And then we have B7. So you have smear at 0, a little bit at 5, none at 15 and 10 seconds. So let's put them all next to each other if I can. I need bigger hands, and I have big hands. All right. Left to right, we have B7, Iroful, View Corona, and original TRP with the times. Gel pen, fountain pen. That is my video, my share. I wanted to talk to you guys about the paper that I was using, why I decided to change papers, a little bit about how I tested the papers, how long I've been working to research the papers. I know there are a lot of shops pivoting from Sanzen TRP for 2026 planners and notebooks and all of the things. I know that some are just now testing and making decisions on papers. Like I said, I made final decisions on my paper by the end of the first quarter of 2025. So I've had my paper locked down, decided, ordered, all of the things for several months. And I did a lot of research and testing and trying to source paper from around October of 2024 through the end of the first quarter 2025 when I made some final decisions. Now, there are a lot of things that go into paper decisions for shops. Obviously, performance is a really big piece, and knowing that you're going to get consistent paper is a really big piece. There are a lot of other factors as well, and I went through some of those that I could go through with you guys. I try to be as transparent as possible, but some are just business things that I can't really share or I don't feel comfortable sharing on my channel, but I try to be as transparent as possible. So I wanted to share with you guys why I made the paper change, how I got to the paper that I got to, and then do testing to show you guys how the paper performed. But that's my all about the paper 2026. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to put them down below and I will definitely get back with you. Give me a thumbs up if you liked this video. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss future videos, and don't forget to just scribble.